Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. So today I am going to give you guys my top 10 books of all time, I think. This was actually really difficult for me to put together because I have a really hard time picking favorites, if I'm being perfectly honest. Like, I could give you guys my top 10 characters of all time, probably. That would be a lot easier than trying to pick my top 10 books of all time. Bear with me, these are in no particular order. I think what my favorite book of all time is. I could nail that down, but other than that, this is completely random, no particular ranking. I know I'm going to be reading a ton of fantasy this next year, and I wanted to have this as a starting point to see how this changes over the next couple of years as I get farther and farther into the fantasy genre and read a ton of series and books that I have not experienced yet. A couple of honorable mentions that I looked at when I was putting this list together are Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, The Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane by Lisa See. I just have so much respect for both of these writers and their character work and the storytelling ability that they have. I don't know that you could get much different in storytelling style than these two writers, but here we are. Lisa See does such a beautiful job writing culture and writing from a generational perspective and just really bringing you into the lives of these characters and the struggles that they face throughout their life. Neil Gaiman, it doesn't really need an introduction, but I love his very gothic, dark fantasy style. There's definitely some horror vibes mixed in there. But at the end of the day, he just tells a really fabulous, richly beautiful story, and I respect him so much for that. I'm going to go back in my fantasy reading age a little bit, and I'm going to bring out The Long Patrol by Brian Jacques. Now, Brian Jacques was an author that I cruised through. I read all of the Redwall books when I was in junior high, and I absolutely loved them. But what I loved about them the most were the Scottish hares and the badgers. The badgers were the best part of these books, in my opinion, and this book chronicles a very cool part of the Redwall history, but especially features my favorite character in the entire Redwall universe, and that is Lady Craiga Rose-Eyes, who is a badger warrior queen, and she just... she was so good. I loved her so much, and this is kind of when she's at the height of her reign and her strength, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I read this book so many times. I loved this book. Brian Jacques, to me, is a master of using the same formula in the best possible way. Like, it didn't matter that the story followed the same kind of line every book. You cared every time, and it was beautiful, and I loved having that experience. And honestly, I credit Brian Jacques as being one of my early influences on my fantasy journey as a reader. Next up, we're going to buzz over to the historical fiction genre with Killer Angels by Michael Shara. Now, this is a part of a trilogy that includes Gods and Generals, The Killer Angels, and The Last Full Measure. This trilogy details a lot of the Civil War and the men who fought in it. This series really brings this part of our history to life in a way that is incredibly approachable and makes you care so much about the people who were involved. It is mostly told from different officers' points of view, but they do a really good job of bringing in bits and pieces of just the average soldier's life. This book specifically covers the days that were spent in battle at Gettysburg in July of 1863. This whole trilogy, honestly, is brilliant. This book of the three is my favorite. It covers some incredibly brave moments during the fight at Gettysburg. Kind of fun tidbit. So The Last Full Measure, which is the book after that, has a lot of information about the Minnesota First, which was a group of men from Minnesota who fought during the Civil War on the northern side. My triple great-grandfather was actually in the 1st Minnesota, and he is mentioned in The Last Full Measure, which is very cool. If you ever read the book, look for Edward Bassett, because he's actually my ancestor, and he is a pretty amazing guy. My family actually owns over 200 letters that he wrote home during the Civil War, and just, it's such a meaningful, beautiful part of history to me, because I've walked where my triple great grandfather walked and did Pickett's Charge, and just So many incredible tie-ins to my family history and just to a very important part of time of our nation's history as well. Next up, I'm going to throw a classic up on this list, and that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book has been incredibly influential on me as a fantasy reader, but especially as a fantasy writer. This book is such a beautiful expose of what it means to be human and all of the questions that Frankenstein's monster asks about himself and the world around him, trying to figure out who he is, what he wants, and what his purpose is. Even existing on this planet are just some of the most beautifully profound character work I have seen in any classic ever, and I love it. Next up, I'm going to pull a work by Brandon Sanderson, which everybody's super shocked by that, but I guarantee you it's probably not the one you're guessing. So I'm going to pull Brandon Sanderson's Legion, The Many Lives of Stephen Leeds. When I read this book, I read it because I knew it was a lesser known work of Brandon Sanderson's, and I was intrigued by the idea of a young man who has hallucinations that they take the form of very specific characters who have very intense skill sets. And Stephen uses his hallucination characters and their skill sets to solve crimes. It's a soft thriller with a lot of incredibly deep mental health themes, and I just found this book to be so good. I burned through it really quickly. I love it. Anybody who's a Brandon Sanderson fan that has not read this book, seriously. It is broken up into 3 novellas. This is the omnibus copy. Stephen and his hallucination characters are just incredibly well written, beautifully interwoven with each other, and I just have so much respect for Brandon Sanderson as a writer because of this book. Next up, I'm actually going to show a book that I don't own yet. I've been slowly picking up the hardcover editions of the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown, and I'm going to put Morning Star up here. Now, Red Rising is a book series that I read fairly soon after it came out, and I cannot tell you how much I absolutely adore this trilogy. Now, I have not read the 4th and 5th books in this series, and part of that was because I was waiting. As you can see, I own them, but I haven't read them yet because I wanted to wait until the 6th book came out in the series, and I have since found out there will be 7 books, so I don't honestly know when I'm going to read these. I'll probably read them when the 6th book comes out and then just wait for the 7th because I'm tired of waiting. But the original 3 books have had an incredible impact on me as a reader and writer. I love the pace of these books. I love the intensity and high stakes of these books and some of the questions that they ask, and the interpersonal relationships between the characters are just beautifully done. One of my favorite fantasy sci-fi characters of all time is in this book. These books are so good, and Morning Star is such a phenomenal finish to a trilogy. I can't recommend it highly enough. If you love fast-paced action with some great, historical inspired sci-fi, this book is excellent. Next up, I'm going to throw Brandon Sanderson on this list again, and that is going to be for Words of Radiance, which is book 2 in the Stormlight Archive. While the Stormlight Archive as a whole, I have a very mixed bag of feelings about, mostly positive, don't worry. Words of Radiance was the book in the series that really sent me on an emotional roller coaster. There are so many incredible things that happen in this book, and my emotions were all over the place, and they were so strong in this book. And that's something that I really appreciate, is when an author is able to really draw those strong emotions out of me while I'm reading. That is a feat, and I very much appreciate the fact that Brandon Sanderson did it in such an artful way in Words of Radiance. Next up, I have Ender's Shadow by Orson Scott Card. Now, this is the kind of parallel book that he wrote for Ender's Game, which is probably what most of you guys are familiar with. Ender's Shadow is a parallel novel to Ender's Game, but it is told through the perspective of Bean, who is Ender's best friend. And let me tell you what, I liked Ender's Game, but I love Bean's story. He is such an incredible little character. He comes from a really hard background. He's a street rat who becomes something really far beyond his wildest dreams and ends up kind of being the secret chosen one. He's kind of the Neville Longbottom to Harry Potter, if you will. But in my opinion, he's a brilliantly written character, and I felt like the whole story of Ender's Game was brought to life in a completely different and more impactful way through his perspective than through Ender's. The next 3 books, I can easily say I can rank these 3 books as being the top of the list. These are the 3 books that I would probably say are my top 3 books currently, and one of them has been on this list for a very, very long time. The second one has been on this list for over a decade, at least a decade, and the other one has been on my list for 2 years. The first one is The Lies of Locke Lamora, which if you've been around my channel for a while, you are probably well aware of the fact that I freaking love this book. I love this book so much. I love Locke. I love the setup. I love the world building in this novel is so beautiful. It's very Spanish inspired, which was kind of a new thing for me. And I just have so many good things to say about this novel. It features an incredible bromance, which is one of my favorite things ever to read in a book. I can, like, romance is fine if it's well done, but give me a bromance over that any day. Platonic, really strong platonic relationships are my bread and butter. I love them, and they will sell me on a book faster than anything else. Lies of Locke Lamora is full of heist, it's full of con men, it's full of thieves, it's full of young coming-of-age boys who don't play well with others, and I just couldn't love it more. Alright, the next one on this list is a book that I read on the sort of early end of my epic fantasy journey back in college. It's been at least a decade since I've read this. I'm planning on a reread of this series very soon because I have so much to say about this series, and this is a book that the scenes and the characters have stuck with me as strongly as when I first read them 10 years ago, and to me that's an instant top of my favorite books list because very few books manage to stay with me in this detail and to this level of emotion for this long. Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. This is book 2 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I don't even know where to start with this book. A lot of people love Memories of Ice, which is book 3, and I totally understand why. I love that book as well. It is so powerful, it is so well done, that ending, oofta. But for me personally, this is still, and I will be shocked if it is dethroned, as my favorite Malazan book that I have ever read. Now, to be fair, I've only read the first 4 books in the series, so take from that what you will. But when I tell you that this book has done more to influence me as a fantasy reader and writer than any other fantasy book I have ever read, I mean that 100%. I was in a book hangover for like a week and a half after reading this book. I couldn't read anything. I didn't want to touch anything else. I just was so incredibly impacted by the emotions that I felt through this book. It's some of the most beautiful, powerful character moments I have ever read in fantasy. The ending is a huge, just mind-blowing experience, and I am just in awe of this series and of this book specifically. Alright guys, last but not least, this is a book that I would say has been the single most influential book of any genre in my life as a reader and writer. It set me up as a person who couldn't get enough of strong, overcomer, character-driven stories. I read this for the first time when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and it has been ingrained in my heart and soul ever since. White Fang by Jack London. Now, this is the story of a wolf who goes through different levels of captivity, through different masters who are incredibly abusive to him, and at the end manages to have kind of a redemption arc, and it is one of the most powerful character novels ever written, in my personal opinion. White Fang is a character that I couldn't get enough of him. When I was younger, I read this book over and over and over again. I always found something new about it, and there was something so powerful about being shown this world through the eyes of a creature who could not speak, but his character says so much, and I could not gush about this book enough. Like, I just love love this book, and this book is really at the heart and soul of who I am as a reader, what I want to accomplish as a writer with the characters that I create. There's a little bit of White Fang in everything I write, and I just love it so much. This is truly my heart and soul book. I just love it. So there you have it, guys. Currently, my top 10 books of all time. Let me know down in the comments if any of these books are on your top 10 list of all time, or what your top 10 books of all time are. I would love to know. I'm very curious to see if this list changes over the next year. I will be doing a lot of reading within the fantasy genre, but also in some other genres. That is the end of my top 10 books currently, I think, of 2022 and previously. Anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell if you want to hang out in my little corner of BookTube. I hope you guys are having a great week, enjoying lots of awesome books, and I will see you in the next video.